Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone. I am Shrija Agrawal, and you are watching our special dispatch, Data Protection in the Global Digitization Era. Many believe that privacy is a human right afforded to everyone, and paradoxically, it is no secret that our personal data is everywhere, especially with this massive wave of digitization, our growing independence on the internet, increase in cloud technology, and the exponentially high growth of social media. They say information is the new currency, and cyber criminals have taken this to heart. They're interested in gaining access to our personal identifiable information and using it for fraudulent and monetary purposes. And so one has to wonder, with our digital world becoming such an integral part of our lives, with data sharing becoming central to the way we operate, can we really preserve our most basic right to privacy? People who endorse data protection say yes, we can. With regulations for data protection, there could be safeguards for how our information is used by businesses, especially social media. Our most sensitive financial and personal information has been in the hands of trusted establishments like banks and hospitals, and we generally have a sense of security by providing these details. And yet, in the course of the COVID 19 pandemic, the new normal is a global environment that's highly digitized, and the routes to access personal data have expanded, which means there's a higher degree of vulnerability and higher odds of a breach. Recently, a joint committee of parliament, JCP, had adopted the final report on the data protection bill in India, which is the world's largest open internet market with more than 800 million internet users. This has been seen as progress, considering the fact that a privacy bill has been in the work for a decade in a country that has one of the biggest markets for many big technology firms that deal with our data. However, the question really is that can it really keep pace with this dynamic economic and social reality that we are living in? Sure, it is absolutely great that we are in this new era of digitization, also called this golden wave digitization. The government is adopting technology and there's a data driven governance is gaining more and more prominence, especially since COVID 19. But while the adoption of technological capabilities can be lauded, doesn't this also mean there's unfettered access to layers and layers of personal data of Indian citizens that's largely unchecked? Who is going to own our data in this information driven world? What is the road ahead for data protection in this golden age of digitization? To break it all down, please help me in welcoming and such an august panel. And I don't think there could have been a better panel to really discuss this. Please help me welcome Cyril Shroff, Managing Partner, Srimachand Mangal Das, Arun Prabhu, partner TMT at Srilmachan Mangal Das, and Bruno Gensarelli, head of international data flows and protection at European Commission. Gentlemen, it's my sheer pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you. I think my first question really is to sort of really begin with the nuts and bolts and beginning of the overarching sort of segment of the conversation, how we sort of began. What Where does India really sort of stand on the path to a globally compliant data protection regime? Maybe I can start with you, Mr. Shroff, your opening remarks, and then get on to other panelists.
Thank you, Shrija, and this is such a timely topic. So I'll make some general introductory remarks, and then, of course, Bruno and Arun can take it forward. So I believe that we are really on the threshold of transformative change on this entire subject. I think India is probably the last to the data protection party in any major economy in the world. I think every other country has some form of framework. We are probably the last to that party, but we also have one of the largest populations. I mean, all of Europe may be about 500 million, and on day one, we will start with a score of 1.5 billion. So, the journey is quite interesting. While there is a lot of, prior history, but I think the recent journey really started with the Puttaswamy judgment from the Supreme Court, which recognized privacy as a fundamental right and made certain recommendations in relation to the need for a privacy regime and legislation, and essentially a general data protection framework. Thereafter, the next step really was the Sri Krishna Committee, which actually gave a very detailed report and also suggested a draft legislation or a bill in 2018, which underwent a lot of discussion. In 2019, there was another milestone when a draft legislation was introduced in the legislature, and then that went to what you just spoke about, the Joint Parliamentary Committee. Uh, it seems that the JPC report should be out anytime soon, which will include a full review of the 2019 bill as well as suggestions for change. And that will be a very significant event that should happen very soon. I expect that thereafter, subject to where they come out on the draft legislation, the bill will be introduced. And my gut feeling is that within next 6 to 12 months, India is going to get a new law, the PDP law. It is expected that we will have a transition period for about 2 years, and then it will go through the in India, when a major legislation comes like this, you will go through your customary rounds of constitutional challenges and all of that. So but at the that's the beginning of the journey. I think we are there is going to be almost like a line of life before PDP and life after PDP. It is that fundamental. So, and I think it's very interesting from a cultural point of view. If we go back to our, thousands of, hundreds of years of history, socially, the privacy has not been a big thing. Everybody in the family knows. We are a very, family-oriented culture. Everybody knows everything. You know everything about your neighbor's family. People don't hesitate to ask you a question of why are you not married, or why don't you have children. So that kind of culture of where we can be very privacy is not essential to the core of an Indian personality. And now with this, it is going to be almost like a sea change, where the focus on privacy, myself, my information is mine. I think that is things are going to change both at a business level as well as at a individual and societal level as well. Businesses are going to have huge implications, both in terms of the obligations and the risk that they carry and the financial burden that they will carry to come in compliance. I think there's going to be almost like a reset of the people's worldview and a whole new set of tools for individuals to protect their privacy. So, go back to my initial comment. We are on the threshold of something very big, and it's now imminent and round the corner.
Thanks for that, Mr. Shroff. I want to understand from you, Arun, sort of taking it further from where he left. He spoke about things like the pre-PDP era and the post-PDP era. That how the PDP bill will go down in the annals of history. He spoke about the fact that there are huge cultural implications, also societal implications, and about the fact that the personal data argument, which is so central to this entire thing. So I want to understand from you, for a country like ours, which is going through this huge wave of digitization, what should the thinking lens be when you put together a bill or a law like that? Two or three thinking lenses that one should really think about. And I would sort of also get Bruno, because he's a specialist in this and he has helped prepare some of those things on what's really the thinking lenses. And I hope that the government bodies are listening to this and making copious notes of this as to what really should be the thinking lens when you put together a bill like this.
So thanks for that, Shrija. I want to take off from where Mr. Shroff said, and he said we're at the cliff, but I feel we're at a precipice. And the reason I say this is because I feel that I don't think the depth and impact of the degree of transformation this is going to bring into the way business is done has fully percolated systems. Now, we've been doing conversations with industry, with the committee, with people who sort of administer the nuts and bolts of this framework, people at MeitY, for the last many years. And there's almost a sense of disbelief around some of what is going to happen. And it's not been helped by the fact that we've all been waiting for Godot for the last 3 to 4 years, and there's always this imminent threat of the bill happening, and you've been looking at this train coming towards you, but you're never really sure as to when it'll arrive. But I feel that we stand on a precipice because in Europe, which has had a culture of privacy since the 90s, starting with some of the decisions of the European courts, you've had the Data Protection Directive, you had all of that. And then even before 2017, you had reams of paper being put out by the Article 29 Working Party, which provided detailed guidance on how this new law would look. With all of that and the smaller population, the relative homogeneity in terms of language and people, the sheer amount of resources that were dedicated, there was still a minor train wreck. On the day that GDPR sort of kicked in, all our inboxes were inundated. And here we look at this massive, diverse economy where there are hundreds of languages, different degrees of comprehension, businesses, and the Indian approach to data has always been, yes, please, can we have some more? Everybody from the security guard in your building all the way to government wants as much data as possible about people. And when all of that data transforms almost overnight from being an asset to being potentially a source of liability, I think this will force a massive reset. So to answer your question, I think the lens of this has to be around the concepts of just ensuring predictability and reasonableness. There has to be visibility on what the standards on. The goalposts must be clearly defined. The requirements that industry is required to comply with particularly must be clearly spelled out, and consequences should be visited in a tangible, measured manner. I think the data protection authorities in Europe, and I know I'm praising Bruno to some extent here, have shown a remarkable degree of restraint in terms of firstly spelling out in great detail what this law looks like, and then putting out reams of guidance on how to interpret little nuances of it, and then slowly starting to hand out fines which make sure that they mean business. One would hope and pray that the Data Protection Authority in India follows the same approach, because if not, we may run into the Indian trend of saying, hey, this is too complicated, let's not comply unless somebody is hit with a fine.
Thanks for that, Arun. I want to sort of get on to you, Bruno. He spoke about some very interesting things. He spoke about the fact that how do you induce culture of privacy in an environment where the culture of privacy has been non-existent? And he spoke about the fact that perhaps Europe has had that for so long. And the lens reasonably, and he spoke about the fact that the lens perhaps could be reasonableness. And if somebody is not complying with it, there needs to be faced with serious consequences. I want to understand from you when you talk about PDP, and Mr. Shaw also spoke about this, the era before PDP and the era after PDP, with the cusp and the precipice, as Arun said, of something extremely, extremely transformational, revolutionary here. So, how does the PDP really differ from GDPR, right from how it is being looked at and its implementation?
Well, first, many thanks thank you for really having me this morning, this afternoon for you. And let me briefly say that first, before going into your question, that we have followed with great interest and appreciation the process that Mr. Schroff summarized, to which the data protection bill was developed in India. And that's for different reasons, because privacy and data is one of the defining issue of our time. And it's very important, it would be very important that the largest democracy in the world, a leading economy, in particular in the tech sector, a world leading economy as India, can fully participate in the development of international standards at the time there is an increasing demand for such standards. It would be extremely important than an important actor, a key actor, such as India adopts a modern and robust data protection legislation that would, of course, constitute also a key example, a key precedent for many other countries around the world. That's one reason. The second reason is because this is an area where actually the EU and India share, to a very large extent, common fundamental values. and where we see great potential for a deeper and mutual beneficial relations between India and the EU, bringing tangible benefits. If you have more convergence between privacy standards, that facilitates data flows. And if you facilitate data flows, you facilitate trade. Trade, not only in the tech industry, but trade in general, relies increasingly on data. Cooperation between public authorities, including in the law enforcement sector, relies increasingly on data. And that's where having convergent doesn't mean identical, but convergent standards can help a lot, and once again can bring very tangible benefits. So this conversation today is, indeed comes at it couldn't be a best moment. We are all anxiously waiting for the report of the joint committee, and it's your question, where do I see elements of commonalities and differences? Well, certainly, and that's something we very much welcome. The EU, through the EU Commission, I'm representing the EU Commission, which is the executive arm of the EU, has extensively discussed these issues with Indian authorities, with Indian businesses. We made, I think, 3 submissions during in response to the various consultations that the Indian authorities exercise. And I mean, in its fundamentals, there's a lot of convergence, I believe, on mainly 3 key elements: an overarching horizontal law rather than sectoral rules. We need data to move across industries, between the private and the public sector. And for that, you need common rules of the game. So having a horizontal overarching framework is very important. That's something that we believe have established through the GDPR, and that's something that the bill also is seeking to establish. A core set of data protection safeguards, not for me now to link them, but we see a number of common principles, common rights, common accountability mechanism, also common, I would say, innovative features such as privacy by design, regulatory sandbox, to explore really the application of data protection rules to new technology or innovative processing. So both, I would say, in the traditional sense of data protection, you find elements of commonalities, and also in some more modern tools. And so a core set of data protection safeguards, obligation, and enforceable individual rights. And then finally, third element, the creation of a dedicated supervisory authority with effective powers to enforce those rules. That's the main lesson also from our application implementation of the GDPR. You need a well-resourced, a data protection authority with expertise and knowledge. Why is that so important? Because it's both important for individuals. Individuals needs to have an easily accessible, a friendly contact point. Many data protection issues are actually of a rather mundane nature, asking access to your data, correction to your data. You don't want your individuals, you don't want to throw your citizens in the judiciary machinery, you don't want to overburden courts with such requests. Having a data protection authority, which often can mediate between the individual and the company or the public authority, is something very important. But it's also very important for business. Those rules, to pass the test of time, data protection legislation has to be technologically neutral, has to be adaptable to a very fast evolving environment from a technological point of view, from a commercial point of view. And you need an actor and a legitimate and independent actor that can adapt those rules to those developments. And that's what a data protection authority can do by bringing also, I think, both the EU and India, we are a different, but we are a federal system, and you need consistency. By definition, data doesn't know border, internal border and external border. You need consistency, you need Arun, you need yes, clarity and legal certainty, and the data protection authority through guidance and through enforcement can bring that. Where we see difference, it's not for me, this is not a beauty context, but we have raised a number of points in our submissions on maybe the need to have a broader range of what I call grounds for processing. Consent is a useful ground for processing, but it's not the only one. It's not always the most appropriate one for a number of different processing situation. We also think that while a legislation, data protection legislation, has of course to fully take into account the specific features, objective needs of the public sector, there should be no blanket exception or too broad exception for the public sector. This can be accommodated. The balancing between different objective and consideration can be accommodated in data protection legislation. This is good for the citizens, this is good for business, but also this is good for the public sector in terms of legitimacy of sometimes very extended, if not intrusive, forms of collecting and processing data. We believe also it is important to have, one can have both a robust system of protection, but a system of protection which is open to data flows, open to the world. There are ways to ensure the continuity of protection also when data is exported to foreign countries, and certain forms of localization or other restriction of that sort. I mean, for us, don't really serve any privacy purpose, and are not good, we believe, for the domestic economy, and there might be other ways to fulfill what these restrictions aim to. The objective of maybe the underlying objectives that explain the introduction of such restrictions. And then we have insisted, and that will be my final point, on the importance of having an independent data protection authority, a well-resourced data protection authority, because that's also, and I mean, we haven't done things perfectly in Europe, and that's certainly not my message. We are learning also from a mistake, and certainly a key element of a successful implementation of these rules is, as I said, the role and the function and the contribution a data protection authority or data protection authorities can bring to this area of law.
Thanks for that, Prun. That was extremely meaningful, and thank you for beautifully summarizing the differences and the similarities that you see between the GDPR and the PPP Bill. You spoke about quite a few things. To summarize this, making notes, you spoke about the fact that the importance of a central data privacy authority should not be undermined in any way. You spoke about the fact that the protection bill has to be technology neutral. You spoke about the fact it has to be agile. So I want to understand from you that there have been some recommendations. Perhaps Arun, you can sort of point out on that. The entire Joint Parliamentary Committee 250-page panel report, which was on the November 22, after nearly 2 years deliberation, some provisions of the bill have actually come in for criticism. And I wanted to pick up perhaps your initial thoughts on this one, because I do know this is currently still in deliberation and a full discussion will happen in the winter session. But before we get into this important second section of what Bruno also spoke about, the consent, I want to get some initial feelers on what you think on this entire provisions of the bill. One of the expert commentary just really coming has been that people are also calling out this bill as Orwellian, and that it is extremely loaded in favor of the government, and the bill has strayed from its core focus, individual privacy, and perhaps put the national interest at the center. Arun, any sort of thoughts and comments on that before we sort of get deeper into the discussion?
Sure. I while the every piece of legislation, I believe, is a balancing act between sovereign interests and the interests of the individual and the interests of enabling business and trade. And it's a balance that moves constantly almost as the circumstances underlying it change. What I want to focus on potentially, and obviously this is still in discussion, the final report is not out, and I am hopeful that some of what we've heard may have been mitigated. But two clear trends that seem to be coming out in this conversation is perhaps some more fetters around international flows of sensitive personal data. Now, this is a subject obviously very close to my heart because quite apart from the conversation on localization, and I know you're not going to let us go without having a more detailed conversation on that, and I look forward to Bruno's heartfelt thoughts on that. But quite apart from the localization conversation, I also feel that the creation of too much subjectivity, the creation of too much delegation, the requirement for an authority to apply its mind to individual data flows, the requirement for businesses to not know whether a data flow that they're enabling is going to be okay or not okay, and whether they're opening up themselves to a fine a few months down the line. The entire reasonable purposes that Bruno pointed out just now, where reasonable purposes are just defined today, in just very brief sentences, and then subsequently the Data Protection Authority is supposed to expand on them. It's one thing to say that you're seeing the tip of the iceberg, which is usually a 20-80 split. It's another thing when it's just a real, just a little stone on top of the iceberg that you can see, and everything else is sort of meant to be written. I feel that some of these provisions run a real risk of over delegation, and one hopes the committee may have landed at a good place on some of these, providing again this framework of predictability and reasonableness, which is what makes the wheels of international business turn. The only other point I want to pick up with response to that, of course, is sophistication. One of the key, sort of rumblings we're hearing, and you've heard the same things we have, is non-personal data being brought within the ambit of the personal data protection regulations. Now, Justice Srikrishna and the committee crafted what was a beautiful document. It was well considered. It was world class. It took from the GDPR and several other places. It deviated significantly from the GDPR in several locations, but they produced something which was indigenized. There was great consideration, for instance, around algorithmic disclosure and the whole concept of automated processing. It was a reasoned exercise. At the risk of being indelicate, it would be a shame if some of that beautiful document were to be scribbled on top with crayons. Which would effectively occur, for instance, if you were to say all data which is not personal in nature is non-personal data, and therefore you're required to report breaches of all non-personal data, which would technically mean that if my phone stopped working and I couldn't access the last 5 websites I'd browsed, that would still require a breach notification. Or if some overbroad regulations around the regulation of non-personal data came in by way of rules, if we've spent 4 years discussing and negotiating the legislation around personal data, it is because there has been a need for that discussion, and people like Bruno, various other bodies of commerce, there have been about 44 meetings that the JPC has done to consult with people on some of this. If that much consideration was needed on personal data, one would argue that at least as much discussion is needed on non-personal data. To bring it in by a rule framework, to my mind, may be potentially problematic. So that's what keeps me up at night lately. One hopes that we'll end up in a better position, and some of this will get mitigated, firstly in Parliament, and second, perhaps by rule making by the Data Protection Authority. But at the moment, this looks like a bit of an open sword.
Thanks for that, Arun. Very, very well said. Let's move to this second very important piece of discussion, this entire sort of story and narration about consent. I'll sort of begin with you, Mr. Shroff. We are seeing this huge liquidity flow happening into India in technology companies, 41 unicorns, 11 months we're talking about. I'm not really sure unicorn is that mythical feature anymore or not, because we seem to have found a lot of it. I want to understand from you, as a unicorn founder, as a potential VC putting its money into India, what is the significance of the PDP bill? How should and till what extent should I know or not know about these important terminologies like consent, localization? because that can really make or mar my business ultimately. So I wanted to begin with you and then get into specifics with Arun and Bruno on this one.
Sure, I think you've hit upon a very relevant segment of the market that is going to be profoundly impacted by the PDP bill. So I think, as you rightly pointed out, India seems to be prolific at this moment in terms of generating unicorns. I mean, we are generating almost one or two a month who are reaching billion-dollar valuations, and most, if not all of them, are based on technology. Most of them are facing retail consumers, and as a result of all of this put together, I think India's sort of image is being recast globally as a center for innovation, and where we are able to create global scale. And any product has almost like a population sized impact in terms of any kind of new interesting idea that can come up. And India has always had STEM skills and therefore technology skills, which are in abundance. But let me just pick a few examples now, whether it is fintech or whether it is e-commerce and various kind of versions of that. These industries are going to collect a lot of personal data, which could be sensitive personal data, it could be sort of critical personal data as well. And at the moment, there is no sort of PDP slash PDP like obligation on these entities. They are working in a free space. There's no malintent at the moment, but at the moment there is no there is no formal obligation on them. And the cost of compliance, when PDP comes and eventually becomes effective, is going to change the economics. So, going forward in terms of these types of businesses, which seem to be flowering in a very prolific sort of way, they are going to be directly impacted by this. They will need to consider how they're going to comply. They need to get ready for this. They need to create the internal frameworks in terms of how they're going to deal with it. All of them will need to have create internal administration. There's going to be a lot of investment on hardware and systems. I'm assuming that they're mostly Indian, but there's some of them who are also going to have sort of global reach as well, and then they will have to comply with a whole new set of frameworks for cross-border flows as well. So, uh, whilst I think every business, including what I would call the old world businesses, everybody is going to be affected. Even firms like us and even media houses like you are going to be affected. But the likes of the fintech and the e-commerce are probably at the eye of the storm, and they will first a have huge data, and b they will need to come into compliance. And because they have kind of grown so fast, they even currently many of them are struggling with basic systems, and this is adding one more layer of complexity on top of that. So I don't think the business model is going to be fundamentally sort of turned upside down, but it is certainly going to add a level of complexity and compliance, and probably for the better, because in a way it also, I think, reduces risk as well. So they
Thanks for
can be
that.
subjected to all sorts of abuse or cyber threats and others. And if they start developing these systems and the protections that come with it, that's good.
It's a very important point, and I'm sure that unicorn founders need to know and make note of this as to what they're getting into. Fintech and e commerce, which has actually extracted the maximum chunk of investments, as you clearly pointed out, is really dire the storm. A lot of things will change, cost of compliance will go up, internal frameworks will have to be set up, understanding the legality implications of the data will have to be well understood from the founders, top down to the bottommost employee, because you are dealing with data and scores of data of people. Most of them are retail facing. Are there more technicalities of this? Arun, you were talking about consent. So, what really is the consent factor? If I were to talk to you in a very simple, non legalese term, if I would download an app from my iPhone or an Android phone, I invariably tend to press this that I agree to the terms of policy of this app. How much of it, of me being somebody who is English speaking, so called educated, it's still pressing in? But within India, there are many Indias. How about somebody who is Vanak, and there's a Vanak app and he's invariably pressing on this? What the risks am I or that person is subjecting himself or herself to?
Uh, Thank you, Shrija. So it's an interesting experiment. If you take a website and you access it directly from India, you probably get a single check the box, which takes away everything from your information to your kidney towards the bottom of that entire thing, and you have one single check the box. You install a VPN and do the same thing for that website in Europe, and you will see a fairly simple, plain English, sentence-wise breakup of granular consent saying, we need your marketing data to market services to you. We need your address to deliver packages to you. We may also use your address to market things to you. And you have separate checkboxes for each one of these things. Obviously, consent can be done properly. The EU has led the charge on this, and businesses have learned to do consents at a granular level. One hopes that we will cross that Rubicon in India as well. It is by no means going to be easy, like as Mr. Shroff alluded to. The second point, of course, is that there are two concepts in India which are very useful. The first is, of course, consent intermediaries, which will be platforms. So basically, these will be platforms which you can use as a consent manager. So you give your consent in just one place, and that manager can talk to you in a language you understand, can communicate with you in a language that you understand. And then that manager will be responsible for administering your consent across multiple platforms. So you can say, to my bank, I give all of the consents I need. To an e-commerce website, I only give the consent they need to give me services, etc., etc. The third factor is a data trust score. There is going to be a format of data auditors who are going to be created under this framework who will sort of come in and will give data trust scores to entities. And like everything else, the market will decide. Entities with higher data trust scores, which are consumer facing, will do better than entities which are lower data trust scores, who are known to have sort of a bad reputation on this, right? So to some extent, I think there are solutions in sight. That being said, I think one thing we're missing for, and again, Bruno brought this out, consent is a fickle mistress. Consent is by definition temporary. If you are a large business which has built out a massive repository or acquired a whole bunch of customers on the back of consent, it is possible that one or more of those customers can go ahead and withdraw that consent at any point in time. And again, there are rumblings of the committee making the flows between businesses even more complex and consent having to be taken at every level. If that is true, then effectively it means that the ability to acquire or sell businesses or acquire or deal in repositories of customers becomes extremely limited. So I want to caution that an over-reliance on consent is extremely problematic. One hopes that the reasonable purposes which are spelled out in the bill are expanded on by the Data Protection Authority and a more workable framework is put in mind. Please.
I think it's time to sort of get to the more interesting part of the discussion, and definitely I'm referring to localization. I think for the purposes of this conversation, I think it's very important to understand what really is localization, and we have to understand the context that we are an economy which is one of the largest recipients of foreign capital, benign liquidity that we are seeing right now. And in this context, we're talking about data localization here, local innovation. We'll get into all of that. But Arun, if you were to tell me that, Shrija, this is the most simplified definition of localization, what would that really be? And where does India really rate on that?
So in very simple terms, localization is the requirement, either express or implied, to keep data within a particular location. So it could be saying you will not take the data out, or it could mean you can only take the data out every third Friday if the moon is blue. Both of those effectively result in a localization regime. Now, like all variants, there are different variants of this. There is soft localization, which says, hey, take it out, but keep a copy here. There is hard localization saying this data cannot leave for any circumstances. And each of these variants has consequences. I'll pause now and hand back to you because I think Bruno will have very interesting perspectives on different types of localization he sees in different jurisdictions.
Yes, Bruno, I was sort of coming to you on this one. Yes.
No, but first, let me maybe say that this is a debate we're following with a lot of interest, because I think any major economy, and I would say society in the world, is struggling with similar concepts and challenges around data sovereignty, given the strategic importance of data, trying also to square a difficult circle between ensuring a high level of protection and being open to data exchanges. Not easy in a it's not easy in a non-tangible environment to ensure continuity of protection when it can be just a matter of one or two click, and moving data is a matter of one or two click. So meaning this is a debate we have a lot of respect for. I want to say that, and we are also following some important decisions of our Court of Justice, which is the Supreme Court of Europe, of the EU. You might have heard about the Schrems II case. We are confronted with issues around that squaring the circle, or that balancing act. Indeed, I mean, Aaron, you have summarized. I mean, there are various forms and various shades of localization, from full localization to keeping a copy, and we are seeing, and we saw in the data protection bill, some of these requirements around certain categories of data, such as critical personal data, sensitive data. And we made those, I mean, those positions are public, and we include them on our submission. We don't think that those requirements are necessary from a data protection perspective, and we also think that they can create unnecessary difficulties and uncertainties, which could hamper business and investments, both for Indian and foreign operators present in India, especially for a country such as India, which is such an important data center and data processing center. And that means that data comes into India, leaves India, back and forth, and each time with, of course, a value being created. But we see at the same time, and I mean, once again, I don't think we in Europe have the secret and the successful recipe, and we are struggling with many similar issues. But we see that there might be alternatives to pursue some of the legitimate aims that are behind such proposals. For instance, I see that. And it was mentioned, I think, that financial data is one of the possible category of sensitive data. Well, our suggestion, our experience suggests that what matters for those handling financial data is their effective protection, in particular data security. And here I totally agree, and it's one of the main lessons of the entry into application of the GDPR. I totally agree with what Mr. Schroff said, is that complying with the data protection legislation is actually a lot of common sense, and it's first of all about mapping your processing. What type of data I collect, what type of data I process, what do I do with that data, under which to safeguard, and that has a almost immediate important benefit for the organization, is to indeed limit risk, reduce risk, reduce or eliminate, or at least mitigate the impact of some incidents such as data breach, which might have an impact not only from a regulatory point of view that you're exposed to fines, but also from a reputational point of view, from a financial point of view. We have seen what has happened to the rating of certain companies which were affected by major data. We showed that aspect of data security, which is important across the industry, is particularly important for the financial industry. And what is also important when you're dealing with financial data from a public authority perspective is the possibility for regulatory, supervisory, and all law enforcement authorities to have access to that data where necessary and proportionate. And in our experience, this does not require localizing the data only in one place, or maintaining a copy of such data in a given country. There are other tools that might be available, such as, of course, the obligation of the operator to make data available if once again there is a legitimate request of any supervisory or law enforcement authority. If you want to reinforce that, designate a representative in the country that can be subject to enforcement action in case of request, which might also be not always complied with, and which would be representative to, which would be responsible to handle that data and to get it from the various locations where it might be around the world. There are, of course, also possibilities that are available on the international instrument in terms of cross-border cooperation to instruments like the Cybercrime Convention, what is called the Budapest Convention, that really are available to avoid the need for data localization, to once again fully, meaning fulfill or pursue, advance those legitimate objectives from public authorities without creating those unnecessary obstacles, difficulties, and uncertainty to, to business, but also to each of us, because we right now, meaning our interaction right now, is relying on data flows. Data flows is an essential element of almost any human activity. Business activity, continuity of government activities throughout the pandemic, research cooperation, etc.
Thanks for that, Bruno, and sort of really playing that out for us, the various types of localization and what might really mean for India. I sort of want to ask you, Mr. Shroff, and a very simple question, while on the topic of localization, really is that, how can businesses, and my question to you is really like, especially younger businesses and unicorns, really operate in a localized world? What does it really mean to be a global company at a time where every country seems to be having its own set of rules now? And COVID 19 has really exposed some of it. I want to really understand from you that if I'm a founder and I want to be a global company, is it more of a headache now or less of a headache?
Uh, Short answer is more of a headache. Because if you're really looking at, say, an Indian originated founded company which has global aspirations and want to be an Indian centered MNC, it will have to comply with the sort of data regimes across whichever markets they're operating in. And many of them may have data localization frameworks as well. They're not going to be all identical. Some could have followed a hard localization approach. Some could be on a soft localization approach. So there will be a huge cost of compliance if they're not able to use global data across and sort of derive trends and sort of use the data properly. So it is definitely going to increase the cost of compliance and also increase the risks because there is a higher chance of breaches, and then the penalties could be quite severe. So this. If I can go back a little bit in history, when the Competition Act came, it was very different from a lot of the other economic legislations at that time because the level of fines and penalties that could be imposed by the CCI was something which you had never heard of. You could have a percentage of the turnover. And this one is going to be similar. I think the levels of fines and penalties that could be levied can go into astronomical figures. I think the DPA is going to be the most powerful regulator in this country on kind of the full potential of what the legislation allows. So it's we are getting more and more powerful in terms of how new regulators are coming, and this takes it to a very different level.
It's about
I'm
time
not
we are
saying it's a bad thing. I'm just making a factual observation.
I think it's about time. We're definitely living in very interesting times here. One quick question, perhaps, Bruno, to you. What we are also seeing in India, you spoke about localization, that a lot of strategic investment is also coming into India. You spoke about fintech, the importance of financial data. If I'm a fintech company and suppose I have a Chinese investor, a Chinese finance company investing in India, it definitely raises concerns on actually who owns the data. Is it that Chinese strategic financial advisor into me? Or is the data locally stored in India? How do I allay those concerns from time to time? And these figures are very large. Bruno or
As for
Arun?
me, I thought this was more from an Indian perspective.
Maybe Arun, you want to step in, and Bruno, you can take your
Yeah,
thoughts.
I'm happy to start off on that, Bruno, and then I'll hand over to you from an
Sure.
international perspective. But I think there's the location of data, the ownership of data, and the insights that can be derived from it can often be three completely different things. You could have data that is perfectly localized. You could have AI run analysis on it. You could train that AI model, and you could take that AI model out of the country, and that would give you deep insight on how that economy and how that works. There is obviously strategic concerns around opportunistic investments into India. We've had the entire Press Note 3 regime around it. We're still working around some of the some of the nuts and bolts of that regime. And obviously, geopolitical tensions will always feed into this conversation. But I think what we must keep in mind is that India has had hard localization regime for financial data for some time now. Between the RBI payment data localization circular, the bans that were handed down on certain types of payment entities from creating new users. India has been working with a hard localized regime for some time. Entities have figured out a way to create India geos, whether that's the large cloud providers or information security providers who service them. And as a result of that, a localized economy has been possible to operate in. I think, realistically speaking, that it's not uh, it's not unheard of for strategic or financial investors to make investments into localized economies and respect the rules of localization that operate. China is a classic example of an economy that is heavily localized. Russia is another economy that's heavily localized. And what you've seen significant inflows of capital into those economies. You've seen innovation arising from those economies, and you've seen those economies operate just fine. So, while I know Bruno may have a very different perspective on this, I don't believe that localization is necessarily antithetical to investment. Now, its impact on innovation, on the other hand, is a completely different question. But I'll hand over to Bruno for his thoughts.
I think it's an interesting point and question raised by Arun here. Antithetical to investments, absolutely not, he says. On innovation, I think he's saying it's an open thing, and he wants to get the viewpoint of the other panelists here.
Well, don't know how to enter into that debate, but of course, localization by definition probably has almost an immediate and mechanical impact on the domestic economy, which could, of course, be an immediate and for certain sector of the economy beneficial, because you need, for instance, to develop some infrastructure. But it depends what kind of economy we're talking about and what kind of value you want to create. This is a very different, I would say, problematic when applied to an economy such as the Indian one, which is global, which is a main data processing center for probably the main data processing center in the world, and where, as I've tried to explain, you need to you have data going back and forth, and the investment and the success of the Indian economies have been about creating values and going up on that value chain, also by attracting the most, I would say, profitable but also sensitive form of data. For instance, when it comes to scientific research, when it comes to certain sophisticated financial data, etc. So for that, I think you at least need, or for that sector of the economy, you need that possibility to come in and out in a certain way, and to use a simplistic term, from the country. What you raise as a question, also referring to other systems, including some that are very close to you geographically, is that, of course, India, the EU, US, Japan, and others, we all want to trade, and we all need to trade, and that involves certain data flows, necessarily involves certain data flows. But I think there has been, in the past years, an increasing realization of the strategic value not only of data but also of privacy. You don't want at least certain type of data to fall into certain hands where they can be indeed accessed, manipulated, used for all sorts of means, including influencing your electoral process, etc. And we have seen, and that's also why it would be so important that India equips itself with a modern data protection legislation. We have seen that debate growing amongst like-minded countries. It's not the EU, but it's Japan who launched, for instance, the Data Free Flow with Trust initiative, where trust means the essential trust in governance access to the data. And why did Japan launch this initiative? Because we need to share data. In the era of artificial intelligence, we need not only to share data, to aggregate data, to create data pools, data oceans, data scenes, data lakes, whatever is the expression. But you want to be sure that you're doing this with partners that share a common set of fundamental values and approach. And you want to be able to develop certain basic standards with those partners. And this is happening. If organizations forward, which were only even a few years ago, we were not typically discussing these issues, such as G20, G20, where India, of course, has a key role, but also G7, OECD, and others are addressing this issue because they see those two considerations. They need to ensure free and safe data flows on the one hand, and challenges created by different systems that have a completely different approach than the one, for instance, very automatically indicated by your Supreme Court. And India needs to be part of this conversation. India is already part of this conversation, but India will be have a greater voice in this conversation if this is backed by a modern data protection framework.
That is so well said and so well put, that India needs to be part of this conversation and has to be backed by an extremely robust data protection framework. And that perhaps is a great sort of getting towards the concluding round of discussion for this conversation. We spoke about consent, localization, impact on businesses, impact on unicorns, the importance of an open data market. Our conversation began with this entire opening remarks on the PPP bill, what the government should be doing, what the legislators to look at, and it's been an extremely insightful conversation so far. I want us to come to you now, Mr. Shroff. The meaning of innovation is also changing very fast, in the sense that when I speak with younger people, just getting the buzz getting younger day by day, this entire thing of decentralization of power, which we are seeing across sectors now. So this entire thing of decentralization of finance. Why should you trust one central authority with my money, with entire regulation, with anything? So that we are dealing in an economy where trust has to be more peer-to-peer led, and that sort of forms the foundation of the entire blockchain economy. I want to understand from you, post the global financial crisis, the way that trust evaporated from a central financial unit, that this is one central regulator managing my money and currency. We're talking about a virtual currency now and the blockchain economy. What is to say that tomorrow there will be a reliance and respect for that one central data authority where everything across the world is getting decentralized? You also to comment on that, and then perhaps you get into the closing remark on how can businesses really, really prepare for the PDP bill, the burning question which we need to address.
So, I think this is one of those cases where my answer is going to be time will tell. um, sort of Indian democracy has always been a little suspicious of excessive power in any one authority. But equally, we have seen that our legal system, slow as it may be, eventually makes its corrections. So we have a Supreme Court that finally sort of steps in and does the right thing. So if there are going to be examples where the line is crossed, I'm expecting that the legal system and civil society will fix it. The nature of our democracy is such that we don't sort of tolerate excess of anything. And we eventually, by default or otherwise, or even by stumbling through sometimes, we'll end up at the somewhere in the middle on most issues. So, whilst I agree with you that, how are we going to build trust in this super powerful mega regulator, and that's going to effectively replacing whatever systems exist just now. And it's one of those things where we'll have to wait and see. And we can have comfort at the back of our mind that we function in a rule of law environment. We have an independent judiciary. In fact, where did this whole debate start from? This whole debate started from the Puthuswamy judgment, and this whole journey which I just described in the beginning. So and what was the crux of the Puthuswamy judgment? That the right to privacy is a fundamental right, and not just a constitutional right or a legal right. It's a fundamental right. So the origin of the thinking started with putting the individual at the center of this entire conversation. Then it kind of evolved, and of course, whilst I think the right to privacy hasn't gone away anywhere, I think what has happened in the subsequent evolutions and layers that have been added is that sovereign interest, business interest, all of these layers have got it on top of it. But at the core of it, on the ground floor, still sits the right of privacy, and that's not going away anywhere. And history and our 75 years of independent history has shown that when certain lines are crossed and when people interfere with fundamental rights, they get an electric shock from the courts, and they back down. So I still have faith. I'm basically an optimist.
Okay, an
But it will
optimist
be
on.
time will tell, and it will go through various hoops and loops before we land up at the right place. Firstly, there will go. I'm pretty sure there's going to be a constitutional challenge, and I can quite imagine some of our favorite judges in the Supreme Court, salivating at the prospect of this coming, and they'll write some 300-page judgment on this. That's going to happen.
Okay. So my question for Bruno and Arun, Bruno, I'll begin with you. How can Indian businesses really prepare for the PPP bill? Perhaps you can share some of your experiences when the GDPR was being constituted. How did you have businesses, especially small and medium businesses, gear up for something like this?
Yes, indeed, preparation is essential. I think big businesses and all smaller businesses, but that are data centric, that have data at the core of their business model, are probably already very well prepared, because they do this anyway. If you want to handle responsibly data, if you want to gain the trust not only of your customers but of your business partners, you do a certain number of things with data in terms of how you process it, the security of your data, etc. A certain number of information around the way you process data. Where the challenges is, and that perfectly allows you, and where the anxiety is, and we have seen, and probably we should have done more that in advance, is with small and medium companies and very small companies, which are the bedrock of our economy in Europe, as in India, as in many other parts of the world. And here, what we have seen, what was essential, is to show, and some data protection authority did very well, have, if you want, guidance or almost manual, how to comply with such requirements in 5, 6, 7 very fundamental steps, which once again are very much common sense, and which also help sort of reduce the anxiety, simplify those requirements into a number of very, as I say, day-to-day common sense step. Information, we also, for instance, finance helplines, which were very much used by smaller businesses around the date of of entry into application of the GDPR. There was, of course, a lot of anxiety around fines, but I was explaining that any responsible company doesn't impose fine overnight. It's not because, I think it was the 25th of May. I was always saying it's not that DPAs will start on the during the night of the 24th of May to impose fines. The Data Protection Authority, their first mission, especially in this first phase, will be to clarify the laws and its requirements, and that's what has happened. But I think that it's normal for any big legislation, especially legislation such as data protection, that his horizontal affects everybody, from the shop down the street to the unicorn, etc. You need really to have, and that's a responsibility, I guess, first of all, of government, to have a very open and dialogue with stakeholders in preparation of the entry into application of the law, and that has to start early and quite upstream, I would say.
Thanks for that, Bruno. So essentially, preparation has to begin early, and there has to be a very clear and open dialogue from the government to the people, because this is a very horizontal law, affects everybody from the unicorn to a small shop owner. Any sort of concluding thoughts on this one, Arun, from your end?
Expanding on Bruno's theme, I think, like I said, while Europe had a history of some of this, and so businesses were somewhat more compliant than they tend to be in India, I think some businesses in India may have to do some soul searching if there is a fundamental business process that is not in keeping with the basic data protection principles such as minimization, localization, purpose limitation, and so on and so forth. It may be time to take a look in the mirror and see if you want to change those. Second, expertise is not as common in India. Data protection officers, data auditors, expertise of that nature will be hard to come by in the months to come. So that's another really important preparatory step. But the most important preparatory step here is your sector regulator. This is hard. This is going to hit people in the BFSI space the hardest. It's banking, financial services, insurance. They're already regulated. There's an existing sector regulator which needs to have a dialogue with the Data Protection Authority so that the principles such as cybersecurity principles, governance principles, and so on that are already common in these sectors are compatible with the requirements that are put out by the Data Protection Authority eventually. There's already CERT-In, which is putting out advisories and sending notices on a regular basis. I think reaching out to your regulator to firstly have dialogues with the Data Protection Authority, to building industry consensus around things like privacy by design and standard practices. Thirdly, bringing out and expanding reasonable purposes. So if you're a credit rating agency, you better be calling your regulator and pushing for the credit rating exception to be defined clearly and possibly, to ensure that all of this framework is put in place before the date on which the bill comes into force, which we hope will be 2 years from now. But all of this background work needs to happen between now and then. It'll be too late to try and do everything on the day the bill comes up, because by that time, a lot of this will be cast in stone and your voice may not have been heard.
If I may, I can only confirm this. Meaning, for us, the real key period was the 2 years between the adoption of the GDPR and its entry into force, and putting in place those guidelines that were also approved after broad consultations. Meaning, we also had to learn that sometimes you have just consultation for the sake of consultation. It must not be a formalistic exercise, because there you really need to get the best practices, to understand what those rules means in different sectors of the economy. So that's, I can only confirm that, and we're still learning to do this together with our regulators.
So we are still learning, and thanks for that. I think it's been such a lovely conversation as part of Winning with Anti-Fragility Cities. We've had so many unicorns and companies, and data protection is such an integral part of that communication and conversation. Before we sign off, we'll do some very quick rapid fire. I do know we are absolutely out of time, but I think one question each for each one of you. I usually have three, but I just get on to one. I'll begin with you, Mr. Shroff. If I'm a fintech entrepreneur, what are the three things which should keep me awake in the night concerning the data protection bill?
cost of compliance, risk of cyber breaches, and the consequences that follow not only financially but also reputationally. And I think the third really would be the risk of actual financial loss if mal actors actually get into my system and play with the data. So all in the same genre, but and these are risks not just because of the new legislation coming. You are essentially, when you are in the tech business, these are risks that you carry, and the risks are getting enhanced every day because technology is getting more and more sophisticated, and the tools that are available to the bad actors are getting stronger and more intrusive.
Okay, Arun, my question to you: COVID-19 and the beginning of the digital surveillance economy. Where are we on this?
Where we very much live in 1984. Whether that is facial recognition, whether that is analysis of patterns, whether that is the consolidation of repositories from various kinds of industries in a central repository, whether that is honeypots being placed in certain locations. We're very much in the middle of a fairly detailed fingerprinting exercise across the world. And, like Bruno said very correctly, I think the question here is doing it within the rule of law, doing it in a manner that is open to scrutiny, and doing it in a manner that is proportional to the purposes that are intended to be achieved.
Bruno, my last question to you: if you had to give one advice or one suggestion to the Indian regulator on the Digital Protection Bill, what would that be? One extremely primary important advice.
To the legislator, yes. Well, to the legislature, I mean, I don't have, it's not for me to advise the legislature. We have already shared opinion, but meaning I can only express all my sympathy because ourselves, we had a long process and of 4 years, and I know how difficult those choices are, how complex that balancing act. But maybe this is my advice: it's all a balancing act. There are no absolute rights. It is possible to accommodate different considerations within a framework, and that's my advice would be to do that. Don't feel that by excluding you create a benefit to the public sector, or to the or to the business community, or to whatever stakeholders. Everybody needs common rules of the game, and in crafting those common rules of the game, you can balance different considerations, and this is also something we are very interested to discuss with Indian authorities, because to a large extent we are very much on the same boat.
Okay, we're very much in the same boat. And thank you so much for this extremely meaningful discussion. Mr. Shroff, Arun, and Bruno, really thank you for taking all your time and energy to just very early for you. And really thank you. Till I see you next. Goodbye and good luck. Thank you once again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks.
Bye
Thanks.
bye.
Thank you, Shita. Thank you. Bye bye.